The music was still echoing in the wedding hall when the first hand struck my face. It wasn't the music of joy anymore, not the laughter of guests celebrating the marriage of my son, but this sudden silence that falls when shame tears through the air. My husband's palm landed on me so hard that my cheek burned, and in that moment, in front of my son, in front of relatives, in front of neighbors and strangers alike, my entire world collapsed. I had lived years with his cruelty hidden behind walls, years of bruises I covered with makeup, years of harsh words I swallowed quietly, but never had he dared to humiliate me in front of everyone. And on the very day of my son's marriage, under the decorated lights and the smiling faces, he decided to expose his rage. He had heard whispers. He had caught glimpses of a truth I never wanted paraded in the open, that I had found love in another man, a man who treated me as if I mattered, who looked at me not with disgust but with longing, who reminded me that I was still alive. My husband knew he was coming that evening. He knew, and the thought poisoned his blood until he turned me into his stage for violence. Support us by subscribing to our channel, so we can bring more stories for you. I did not cry when his hand landed on me. I did not fall apart when his voice rose like thunder, calling me a disgrace, a curse, a woman unfit to be a wife or a mother. I only stood there, my body trembling, but my eyes steady, while the guests shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their gaze, others pretending not to see, and a few staring with hunger for scandal. My son, dressed as a groom, frozen like a statue, caught between the two worlds, loyalty to his father and shame for his mother. No one stopped him, not even when he pushed me back so hard that I stumbled into the chairs, knocking over glasses that shattered like my years of silence. The hall went quiet except for the music still humming from the speakers, a cruel soundtrack to my humiliation. And yet, in that silence, something broke inside me. Not just the fear that had chained me for decades, not just the obedience drilled into me from girlhood, but the part of me that believed I had no right to happiness. He had exposed me to the world, yes. He had struck me before the eyes of my son, yes. But he had also given me the courage to do what I had never dared, to say enough. When the guests whispered behind napkins and the relatives tried to pretend nothing had happened, I reached for my phone. My hands shook, but not from fear, from determination. I called him, the man who loved me, the man whose presence had already lit the rumor in my husband's mind. I called my boyfriend, and my voice did not waver. "Come here," I said. "Come now." It was like setting fire to dry wood. Within minutes he walked into the hall. Not as a thief in the night, but boldly, his eyes meeting mine, then cutting straight through my husband's. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. My husband's rage boiled over, the groom's wedding forgotten, the food untouched, the guests reduced to shadows. He lunged, fists ready, words like knives. My boyfriend did not back down. 2 men fighting over a woman, yes. But to me, it was more than that. It was the collapse of an empire built on fear, and the rise of a woman who had lived too long in silence. Chairs were thrown, voices screamed, relatives tried to step in but were shoved aside. My son, still in his wedding attire, stood helpless, his life's happiest moment smeared with blood and scandal. I should have felt shame, perhaps guilt, but I felt only release. Every blow my husband threw was not just at my lover but at the years he had stolen from me. Every punch my boyfriend returned was not just defense, but vengeance. For every night I lay awake wondering if I would ever matter to anyone. The chaos could not last forever. Someone called the police. When the sirens wailed outside the hall, when officers stormed in, pulling the men apart, the guests finally exhaled. The officers did not look at me with judgment. They looked at me with pity, perhaps, or with the tired eyes of men who had seen too much of family wars. They pulled my husband away, still screaming that I had disgraced him. They held my boyfriend back, his chest heaving, his shirt torn, his knuckles bleeding. They asked me questions, but I did not answer. I only looked at the faces around me. My son's torn expression, my relatives' hungry whispers, my in-laws' disgust, the world that had always expected me to be quiet. And then I made my choice. I stood there in front of everyone, in front of my son dressed as a groom, and my husband dragged by the police, and I declared it. I want a divorce, I said. My voice cut through the room like a blade. My relatives gasped. My in-laws hissed, but I did not care. For the first time, I felt the weight lift. I was not a shadow anymore. I was not his possession anymore. I was not the woman who cowered in silence. I was free, or at least ready to fight for freedom. The divorce did not happen that night, of course, but the decision did, and with that decision came another. One that would turn whispers into shouts, scandal into history. If my husband thought striking me in front of the world would silence me, he was wrong. If the world thought I would crawl back into shame, they were wrong. Because when my son married that night, under the lights and the broken smiles, I made sure I would never be left behind. I signed the papers. I took my place. And I married the man who had loved me when no one else dared. On the same day my son became a husband, I became a wife again. Mother and son, side by side. 2 weddings under one roof. One born of tradition, the other born of rebellion. The world called it disgrace, but I called it survival. The guests whispered that it was madness, but I called it fate. My son and I married on the same day. But our lives could not have been more different. The slap landed before I even realized his hand had risen, and the sharp sting across my cheek echoed louder than the music and laughter in the wedding hall. My son's marriage should have been the happiest day of my life, a day where joy should have flowed like the garlands of flowers hanging across the stage. But instead it became the day my husband decided to strip me of every last shred of dignity I had left. Guests gasped, chairs scraped, whispers rose in waves, but no one moved to stop him. Not my relatives, not my in-laws, not even my son in his groom's attire, frozen between the pull of blood and shame. For years I had endured his fists in silence, tucked away behind the walls of our home, where bruises could be hidden and tears could be wiped before anyone saw. But that night, he dragged our private hell into the public eye. His rage boiled over because he knew something. He knew about the man I had let into my life, the man who reminded me that I was more than a punching bag, that I was still a woman, worthy of tenderness. My husband's pride couldn't handle it. Not on the night when he wanted the world to see his power and control. So, in front of everyone, he chose to humiliate me. I did not cry. My body trembled. Yes, but not from fear. Fear had long ago become a constant companion, one I no longer allowed to steer me. What shook inside me was something else. An awakening. A rage of my own. A voice that had been strangled for decades, clawing its way to the surface. While my husband screamed that I was a disgrace, while the guests tried to look away and pretend the scandal wasn't unfolding before them, I picked up my phone with hands that no longer shook. I called him. My lover. My secret. The man whose smile made me believe in life again. My voice did not waver when I said, "Come. Now, When he arrived, the entire hall seemed to stop breathing. My husband's eyes darkened, and before anyone could stop it, fists flew. 2 men, colliding like storms, tables crashing, glasses shattering, relatives crying out but unable to contain the fury that filled the room. My son's wedding descended into chaos, his garland of flowers falling crooked around his neck as he stood there watching his parents tear apart his world. My heart should have broken for him, but in that moment all I felt was release. Every blow exchanged was more than a fight between 2 men. It was my husband's years of cruelty crashing against the love I had finally allowed myself to feel. Guests tried to pull them apart. Women screamed, but nothing stopped it until the wail of sirens pierced the night. Police stormed the hall, dragging the men apart. My husband spitting venom, my lover's shirt torn and knuckles bleeding. And then every eye turned to me. I don't know where the strength came from, but I found myself standing tall. My voice rose above the murmurs, strong and clear. I want a divorce. The hall gasped. My relatives recoiled. My in-laws hissed as though I had cursed the heavens. But I did not falter. Years of silence had built to this moment. He could humiliate me. He could strike me. But he would never again own me. That night I ended it. And while my son exchanged vows with his bride, while my relatives clutched their pearls at the scandal, I made my own vow. I would no longer live for fear. The divorce proceedings dragged on, messy and vicious. But I did not back down. People whispered about me in markets. Neighbors gossiped. Families distanced themselves. Shameless, they called me. A curse. But they weren't there on the nights when my husband's fists slammed against my body. They weren't there when I begged the silence of my pillow to swallow my sobs. They didn't know what it was like to be invisible in your own home. So I let them talk, let them spit their poison. I had tasted worse and I had survived. When the papers were signed, when I walked out of the court with freedom clutched in my trembling hands, I did not return to the house that had been my prison. Instead, I took his hand. The man who had stood by me, who had fought for me in front of the world. And together, we built something new. The whispers only grew louder when, on the very same day my son became a husband, I too stood before witnesses and pledged myself to a man, mother and son, 2 weddings, one under the weight of tradition and expectation, the other under the fire of scandal and defiance. People said I had ruined my son's life, tainted his wedding, brought disgrace upon the family. Perhaps I did, but I also saved myself, and sometimes survival looks like sin to those who never dared to fight for their own lives. The days that followed were not easy. My son's eyes grew distant, caught between the love he bore me and the shame society forced upon him. My new marriage was not celebrated with garlands and blessings, but with curses and judgment. Yet, in the quiet of our home, when my husband, my true husband, not the tyrant I divorced, held me close and whispered that I mattered, I knew I had chosen right. For once I had lived not for them, not for reputation, not for silence, but for myself. And if the world never forgave me, I would still walk with my head high, because I had finally learned to love the woman staring back at me in the mirror. The first night after the court stamped my divorce papers, silence filled the room. Not the silence I had known before, heavy and suffocating, but a silence that breathed. I sat on the edge of the bed in my new home, fingers trembling as they brushed across the crisp sheets, and I realized this silence was mine. No footsteps thundering down the hall. No harsh voice ready to find fault in whatever I did. No clenched fists waiting for the smallest mistake. My husband, the man who had once been my captor, was gone from my life. Yet freedom did not feel like fireworks or celebration. It felt fragile, like a glass in my hands that could shatter with the smallest slip. The neighbors had already begun their whispers. Women outside my gate slowed their steps, their eyes heavy with judgment. Men muttered about how I had shamed the family name, how I had destroyed my son's respect in society. Even my relatives distanced themselves, treating me like a disease that might spread to their daughters. But none of them came when my body was black and blue, when I hid my face with powder to cover the bruises, when I swallowed my cries so the children wouldn't hear. They had left me to suffer then, so why should I let their words poison me now? Still, it hurt. At the market, when I bought vegetables, vendors exchanged looks, mocking smirks cutting deeper than knives. At weddings, when women gathered in circles of laughter, the moment I stepped near, their voices would drop, and their eyes would pierce me like daggers. I became a story they told each other to feel better about their own cages. At least we're not like her, they must have whispered. But at night, when the world quieted and my new husband, my true companion, sat beside me, I felt the warmth of something I had long been denied. Gentleness. His hands never raised in anger. His words never sharpened into knives. Instead, he listened. He asked about my day. He cared about my thoughts. And in that care, I found pieces of myself I thought had died years ago. Yet not everything healed. My son, the child I had carried, the boy whose scraped knees I once kissed better, looked at me with eyes that were no longer soft. He avoided my calls, kept his visits short, and when he did come, he barely met my gaze. The distance was worse than any beating I had endured. I could survive society's cruelty, but the silence of my son gnawed at me like an endless hunger. I had chosen freedom, but in doing so, had I lost him forever? One evening I gathered the courage to visit him. His bride greeted me with forced politeness, her smile tight and cold. The house smelled of fresh paint and jasmine, a new life he was building, a life I felt like an intruder in. My son sat stiffly on the sofa, his eyes on the floor. I tried to speak, to explain, to tell him that I had suffered for him, that I had chosen life for myself after decades of death. But the words caught in my throat when I saw the shadow in his face. Finally he spoke, his voice low and cutting. "Ami, you could have waited. You could have let my wedding pass. You didn't have to make it about you." The words struck harder than any slap ever had. I wanted to scream that it wasn't about me, that it was about survival, that if I hadn't stood up then, I might never have found the courage again. But I saw it in his eyes. Society had already poisoned him. To him I was not a survivor. I was a disgrace. I swallowed my tears and left, my body heavy, my heart a stone sinking in an endless sea. Days turned to months, and the storm did not calm. My ex-husband poisoned relatives against me, spinning stories that painted me as a sinner, a selfish woman who had destroyed her family for lust. No one wanted to hear my truth. They only wanted to protect the comfort of their own lies. Yet through it all, my husband stood firm beside me. He told me that survival was never meant to be easy, that choosing love in a world built on fear would always come with scars. He told me that one day my son would understand, even if today he could not. But the nights were long. Sometimes I would sit by the window, watching the world move on, wondering if I had chosen wrong. Was freedom worth losing, my son? Was love worth the hatred of society? Yet when I closed my eyes and remembered the fists, the broken glass, the silent sobs on the cold floor of my old home, I knew the answer. Yes. Freedom was worth it. Love was worth it. My life was worth it. Years passed. Slowly the whispers grew quieter. New scandals replaced my story in the mouths of gossiping women. My son, still distant, began to soften with time, though the wall between us never fully crumbled. But when I held my grandchild for the first time, tiny fingers wrapping around mine, tears spilled down my cheeks. In that moment I felt the cycle breaking. This child would not grow up in a house where fists replaced words, where silence drowned screams. This child would know love, real love, because I had chosen it for myself. And maybe, just maybe, one day my son would look at me and not see shame, but strength. Maybe he would understand that his mother was not weak, that she had fought a war few dared to fight, and that she had won. Money. That was the next battlefield. When I walked out of that house, I didn't just leave behind a husband. I left behind years of financial dependency, control, and manipulation. He had always made sure I had no access to the accounts, no knowledge of where the money flowed. My earnings, my savings from sewing clothes for neighbors, from tutoring children in the evenings. He had snatched all of it slowly, under the pretense of family responsibility. I walked out with nothing but a suitcase, a few clothes, and a bruised soul. My new husband was supportive, but he too was not rich. He worked hard, lived with dignity, but carried no fortune in his pockets. We rented a modest house, small enough that I could hear the echo of my own footsteps in every room. The walls were cracked, the paint chipped, but for me it was a palace, because no one raised a hand in anger there. Still, peace did not fill the stomach. Food had to be bought, bills had to be paid, and slowly the weight of survival pressed on my shoulders again. I went back to the skills I had once been mocked for. Needle and thread became my weapons. I stitched late into the nights, fingers bleeding at times, eyes burning under the weak glow of a single bulb. Word spread among women in the neighborhood. They came with fabrics, designs, hopes of looking beautiful in clothes made by my hands. I poured my soul into every stitch, as if sewing my broken life back together. My husband helped, carrying bundles to the bazaar, bargaining for thread, even delivering finished clothes when my legs swelled too much to walk. But society wasn't kind. The same women who brought me work whispered behind my back. She divorced her husband and married again. Can we trust her with our clothes? What kind of woman is she? Their words stung, but I never let my hands stop moving, because I knew. Silence could not feed me, but determination could. My son heard these whispers too. When he visited, he avoided looking at the sewing machine in the corner. Once he even muttered, "You've lowered yourself, Ami. Couldn't you just live quietly instead of parading your disgrace?" My throat tightened, but I didn't argue. How could I make him understand that dignity wasn't in silence? It was in survival. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Slowly the little business grew. Women who once mocked me began praising my designs. Orders came in bulk. I trained 2 young girls from the neighborhood. Girls whose fathers wanted to marry them off at 14. Teaching them gave me more than money. It gave me purpose. Their laughter filled the small house. Their dreams became mine. And for the first time, I felt I was planting seeds for a better future. But every step forward had shadows. My ex-husband, bitter and vengeful, spread lies in the community. He told people I was still meeting other men, that my second marriage was a sin, that my business was nothing but a cover for immorality. Some believed him. Customers canceled orders. Friends turned their backs. The cruelty of his voice carried further than the strength of my hands. Then came the day that nearly broke me. One of my son's friends came to my door with a warning. "Your ex is filing a case. He says you abandoned your responsibilities, that you left your son for another man. He wants to strip you of whatever little respect you've rebuilt." My body went cold. Again I was dragged into the court of society, forced to defend my very existence. I stood before judges who didn't care about bruises, who didn't care about years of abuse, who didn't care about a woman's survival. They asked me why I had married again so quickly, why I had chosen myself over family honor, why I had destroyed the image of a perfect household. I answered with trembling lips but steady eyes. Because I wanted to live. Silence fell in the courtroom. My ex sneered, but my words carried a weight no lie could erase. The case stretched for months, draining what little savings we had. But in the end, the truth could not be buried forever. The court dismissed his claims. I walked out with shaking knees, but also with the faintest smile. I had fought another war and survived. Still, the damage was done. My son barely spoke to me. He believed his father's poison more than my truth. At night, when I lay beside my second husband, I cried quietly into the pillow, my chest aching with the loss of a son who was still alive, but unreachable. My husband would stroke my hair, whispering, "One day, he will see. One day he will understand." I wanted to believe him, but hope was a fragile thing. Years passed. My business flourished. From one sewing machine, I grew into a small workshop. The girls I trained became masters themselves, spreading their wings. The little house that once echoed with emptiness now buzzed with life and laughter. Society still whispered, but their voices faded as my success grew louder. I was no longer just a divorced woman, no longer just a scandal. I became the woman who could create beauty out of rags. Then one evening, a knock on the door changed everything. I opened it to find my son standing there, his eyes hollow, his shoulders slumped. Behind him, his wife carried a bag, her face swollen from tears. My heart stopped. For years I had dreamed of this moment, but not like this. He looked at me and whispered, "Hummy, my marriage is breaking. I don't know what to do." In that instant, the years of anger, the accusations, the silence, all melted away. I pulled him into my arms, and for the first time since he was a boy, he let himself cry against my chest. His pain spilled out in broken words. His wife had left him for another man. He had fought, begged, tried to hold his family together, but nothing worked. And now, the same society that had mocked me was mocking him. I listened, every word cutting deep, because I knew that pain. I had lived it. And finally he looked at me with wet eyes and said, "Ami, I used to think you were weak, but now I see you were stronger than all of us." My tears fell silently. In that moment I was no longer just a mother or a woman scarred by the past. I was proof that survival was possible, that no matter how much the world broke you, you could rise again. And as I held him, I knew my story wasn't about shame. It was about strength, not just for me, but for every woman who thought she had no choice, for every mother who thought her pain was a cage, for every daughter who feared her voice. My scars were not a burden anymore. They were my crown. After that night, my house was no longer silent. My son began visiting often, sometimes alone, sometimes with his children. The first time I saw my grandchildren, tiny hands clutching at my dupatta, eyes wide with innocence, I felt something shift inside me. The cycle of pain that had haunted me for decades suddenly had cracks where light could seep through. Their laughter filled the rooms, bouncing off the walls that had once heard nothing but my sobs. But life, as always, never let me rest for long. My ex-husband's downfall was slow, but it came. Word spread that the same friends who once drank with him, who once nodded along to his lies, had abandoned him. He had lost his job, then his savings, and finally, his dignity. One afternoon, while returning from the market, I saw him on the roadside. He sat on a broken bench, his hair wild, his clothes torn, a man reduced to a shadow. For a moment I froze. This was the man who once held so much power over me, who could silence a room with his anger, who had humiliated me in front of hundreds. Now he couldn't even lift his head to meet my eyes. I don't know what I felt. Not joy, not pity, not revenge, just emptiness. I walked past him without a word. That was my closure. Not screaming at him, not punishing him, but realizing he no longer had any place in my story. He was just a chapter I had survived. Back home, my new husband and I built something fragile but real. He never made grand promises, never claimed he could erase my pain. He simply stood beside me, quietly, faithfully. When my hands ached too much to sew, he took over. When customers argued, he handled them with patience. And when my nightmares woke me in the middle of the night, he whispered, "You're safe now." In a world where men had only ever taken, he gave. But the true miracle wasn't him. It was the fact that I had learned to give myself a life again, that I had stitched together a broken soul with thread and willpower, that I had raised my voice even when it shook, that I had taught girls to fight their own fates so they wouldn't become another me. The turning point came years later when my son stood in front of a crowded hall during a community gathering. He was asked to speak about resilience, about facing hardship. And do you know what he said? He said, "My greatest teacher wasn't a man, wasn't a school, wasn't a book. It was my mother, the woman who survived everything and still stood tall." The room clapped, but I sat in the back with tears streaming down my face, because for the first time in my life, my son didn't just see me as a mother. He saw me as a warrior, and now as I sit here, an old woman, my hair silver, my face mapped with wrinkles, I tell you this story not because I want pity, not because I want applause, but because somewhere out there, another woman is sitting in the dark thinking she has no way out. She believes the world has ended, that her voice doesn't matter, that her survival is impossible. To her I say, it is not over. The world will try to silence you, break you, bury you. But if you hold on, even if it's just with trembling fingers, you will rise. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will. And before I finish, let me remind you, if my story touched you, if you want to hear more stories of survival, betrayal, and the strength hidden inside broken women like me, then please support us. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notifications. Because every story I tell is not just my voice, it's the voice of thousands who were never heard. My scars will fade one day, my body will return to dust, but my words, my truth, my fight, they will live as long as someone listens. And tonight you listened. That is my victory.